Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. I'm really excited to be joined by Şeyda Kurt today, who is a German journalist and best-selling author. Very interesting. Her first book was titled Radical Tenderness, and she made what seems like to some a bit of a shift, and then second book was titled and has been translated to English, Hate on the Power of a Defiant Emotion. Welcome to the show, Şeyda.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Elif.
So, Şeyda, you argue that there's essentially a hierarchy of hate. Some people are allowed to hate, particularly political elites that can whip up hysteria, and we're seeing this really across the world at the moment. States can wage wars, seemingly fueled by hatred, when, of course, usually and in reality, it's about their own interests and gains. And that's just called governance. But when marginalized or colonized nations or communities express rage about their oppression or take action around their rage about their oppression, suddenly it's either irrational, dangerous, divisive, and what has become in, the most extreme cases, terror and terrorism. They're told to calm down, be civil, perform perfect victimhood, and you might get a tiny piece of the cake. In Britain, where I grew up, it's basically a core British value, which is to supposedly keep calm and carry on. Given what's happening in our world right now, from, genocide to the rise in authoritarianism and the far right, who gets to be furious in our society and who has to swallow it?
I think, first of all, we need to understand that liberal societies and liberal discourse always require an unspeakable outside, as you already mentioned, and an ultimate other that is excluded from what is imagined as a democratic or civilized discourse. So the boundaries of this discourse may sometimes be flexible or temporarily expanded. For example, in recent years, there was a moment, especially in white feminist or liberal anti-racist circles, when anger suddenly became fashionable or even cool, and people styled themselves as the angry woman, proud angry woman. At the same time, however, we know that labels like angry Black women still carry serious disadvantages for those who are targeted by them. So this discursive boundaries ultimately remain in place, and they mark which people are allowed to remain part of a social debate and under what conditions, and who's excluded altogether because they are seen as having the wrong, for example, argument or the wrong emotions. And when it comes to hate, the stakes are even higher. It is not only that people who hate are considered disqualified from liberal discourse. If we look at the history, the question is more actually about who counts as human and who does not. So historically, the accusation of being driven by hate has often been projected onto colonized people or the proletariat. So philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes were already spreading like very crude racist theories in the 17th century, portraying humans as fundamentally hostile with the nature of a predator. And I think it's no coincidence that it's also the time where like capitalism is emerging. And the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807, even declared hatred as a natural trait of African people, like describing them as examples of isolated, unsociable spirits, as he says, of people who fight one another to the death in their hatred. So
Mm.
the idea is because the colonized Black African person is imagined as inherently hateful and, as Hegel said, overcome by ancient hatred and trapped in endless internal struggles, they were considered incapable of civilization. So that meant incapable of building a society based on peaceful coexistence and mutual recognition of rights in a bourgeois sense, And throughout the 19th century, this racist assumption circulated widely among Western thinkers, and it was used to justify colonial conquest, exploitation, and
Mm,
destruction.
mm,
And this is one of the reasons why liberal societies never want to be associated with hate. They constantly need to distance themselves from what they imagine as the uncivilized and the inhuman, as you said. And at the same time, this expectation becomes a burden for oppressed people themselves in their political struggles. They're often forced to prove that they're not hateful because otherwise their supposed inhumanity would be confirmed. And one example I think about very often is Serpil Temiz Unvar, who is a Kurdish mother who lost her son Ferhat in the racist terror attack in Hanau here in Germany in 2020, where white supremacist fascists murdered 9 young people with migrant backgrounds. And he had publicly announced the attack beforehand and legally owned a weapon. And even though his fascist views were known to the authorities, and during the attack, the police emergency line was not staffed. The police intervened late, and afterwards, they even treated the victims' families with suspicion and violence. And it also later emerged that a special police unit on duty that night was linked to a far-right network. So Serpil Temiz Unvar has since been tirelessly demanding accountability in public for the murder of her son Ferhat. Yet she also repeatedly emphasizes, I am angry, but I do not hate this country. And whenever I hear that, I think, sister, you would have every right to hate this country and this state and its institutions that have protected the accomplices of this crime to this day. But when you have to work with those very institutions, and we should also, I think, consider that anti-racist work in Germany has increasingly become institutionalized and absorbed by the state in recent years. Of course, you're often forced to stay within the limits of liberal discourse, and you must perform the perfect victimhood, and only then your cause is kind of, yeah, legitimate.
mm, mm. I mean, I guess what basically you've been saying, and what you explore in your book as well is, the question of who gets to hate is essentially who gets to be human, right?
Mhm.
And the kind of hateful um, attributes, particularly associated to, particularly colonized peoples and particularly those across the continent and Africa, it's quite a long school of thought that, um, you know, connected to what you said, there's a whole area of supposed scholarly work that basically suggests that any slave rebellion was those of crazy people. So like it pathologized rebellion against one's own conditions, right? And perhaps to subvert that a bit, you've said that you'd be horrified to be remembered as a peace-loving hippie, and that the politics of, love and light, the politics of love and light is everywhere, particularly on the liberal left, it seems. It seems that for many of them, it's the default, the safe position, the thing that everyone can agree on, because that's one of the narratives, I'm sure we can all agree on. That's always, a line that is used, right? But it also seems that for some, that kind of, let's say, world of being feels like a mass Truman show almost. Um, I've always thought personally of love as, what I'm for and hate as what I'm against. Like that's how I think of it. And for that reason, I've always felt like we should be led by love. But still, what are the different uses of hate and why is love not enough sometimes?
I mean, I'm not against politics of love. As you know, as you already mentioned, my first book is actually about that. And I think love can be or is an important political tool of solidarity. It can be a corrective in times when the, yeah, pervasive violence and destruction around us makes us numb or cynical. It reminds us that we must care for one another, make promises to each other, and take responsibility for a future that sometimes feels almost unimaginable. But the idea that we only need to love more in order to persuade our oppressors not to kill us, to imprison us, or deny our humanity, that is a big, big lie. And
Mm,
we cannot love our way out of patriarchy, colonial capitalism. We cannot reconcile with the systems. There are things we cannot be conciliatory about, like no justice, no peace. That is something I think the left should be able to agree on. And today we hear similar arguments when liberals claim that what society currently needs is simply more empathy to address violence or social division. And sometimes they even get really angry with me for talking about hate. And they say, like, people like you are deepening these divisions. I mean, I have also nothing against empathy, but more empathy will not eliminate the divisions of capitalist society because those divisions, class or race or gender divisions, are objective realities and
mm,
necessities in capitalism for the system to work.
mm,
So responding to those divisions with hatred does not create them. It merely makes visible the divisions and conflicts that already exist. And that is why I think we need hate alongside love, grief, and many other emotions that are already part of our political struggle. Because hate reminds us where we refuse reconciliation, where we do not want to make false compromises, and where we need to recognize our enemies in order to build strategies that can actually challenge these systems of oppression and be effective. And ultimately, I also want to break this false dichotomy between love on the one hand and hate on the other. We do not have to choose. Like humans, as well as political movements, can sustain a plurality of political emotions at the same time. And I also think that there is a lot of hatred in the world, and much of it is justified, like hatred among oppressed, marginalized, or criminalized people, poor people. And the far right has been very successful in channeling that hatred. And the left will not succeed in doing the same if it is unwilling to confront those in power or to say openly that we have the right to hate them.
And I suppose, what I'm hearing from, what you're saying today, but also, in both in your book, but also in your other interventions, it's also seems to be an attempt to break the long held kind of the approach or the method that for anything to be taken seriously, it needs to be completely devoid of emotions. And
Mhm.
that devoid of emotions basically, has throughout history served to, at the very least, maintain a status quo, which might be, from slavery to other forms of oppression and so on. And, I like that you brought in, basically the broad systems that also uphold this and therefore why some of these emotions are also important or can be useful. I was also It was interesting because I think it was in the opening or like, towards the start of your book where you talk about when you was asked by someone who was attended a workshop that you was giving, should we hate Nazis? And you said that, more or less, essentially, your answer was quite unequivocal, which is that absolutely we should hate them. In a political climate that tells us to seek dialogue with fascists, as you've just said, to empathize with the systems that uphold these different expressions of, power and oppression and so on, to supposedly find common ground. You write that indignation runs out of words, anger runs out of air, but hate remains. You also interestingly point to Rojava as a living example, a movement that didn't just oppose nationalism, capitalism, and colonialism, but built an alternative. So, actually, similar to what you just said in terms of it's important to be for something as well, right? And it was also interesting to me because in the book you kind of explore kind of different ways that hate has been explored in more, in writing in general, from like the philosophical to actually sometimes like the whimsical of, of being a hero because one didn't kill a fly or things like that. Um, what makes hate the emotion that sustains a struggle when everything else burns out?
I think, first of all, I would like to clarify one thing. Like when I speak about hating Nazis or fascists, I'm not talking about hating my neighbor unemployed who is considering voting for fascists in the next election. I mean, of course, that makes me angry and I'm worried about this, but I think that requires a different political strategy. But the leading fascist and capitalist elites absolutely must be hated with everything we have because we have no longer like the luxury of simply wrinkling our noses and playing by the polite rules of liberal discourse. And hatred has always been also a part of proletarian anti-fascist struggles and debates because we also are the ones who are attacked and threatened by fascists. So I think there's a very interesting point that German philosopher Helga Landwehr makes. She says, like, yeah, society always, as you already said, expects from us to go into like dialogue and be neutral towards these people, or even what they allow sometimes somehow is that we react with contempt. That's at least what like liberal elites are doing, like when they don't want to be associated or kind of want to distance from themselves from like fascists or these Nazis. They just, you know, roll their eyes, shrug, and move on. But for us, that is impossible because these people directly threaten me and the people I love. And contempt would come from a position of superiority. And and Hilge Landwehr, the German philosopher I mentioned, said that this fits very well into the emotional neoliberal landscape because of turning away and indifference. That is basically what contempt is. And we as leftists or migrants are not in the position of superiority, like unfortunately. We cannot be indifferent about racism or fascism. So what do we need instead? Like Helge Landwehr, the philosopher, says hatred, by contrast, often comes from a position of subordination, and you have to fight what is harming you. And this contains the potential for change. Like in a society structured by hierarchy and oppression and class oppression, hatred tends to come from below, and while contempt comes from above. So another interesting point that you already spoke about is also the question of, okay, what is the difference between hate and anger? And I often illustrate this with an everyday example. I say, for example, in a romantic relationship, there's a huge difference between a partner saying, I'm angry with you, and saying, I hate you. And if someone says, I hate you, if my partner says, hate you, it puts the ground from under my feet because it is a radical questioning of the relationship itself. It is not simply saying, you need to do this better. It questions whether the relationship should exist at all. And anger is therefore, I would say, more reform orientated emotion. And hatred is the emotion of abolition, the abolition of a relationship or of order. And hatred is like stubborn emotion that fixes our attention on something that harms us and we cannot simply ignore. At the same time, it radically questions that very relationship. And when translated into action, can generate the agency needed maybe to overcome it.
I mean, you touched on you know, some of the kind of like basically hate being an abolitionist emotion. And, you know, many, particularly on the left, are drawn to, and it's become particularly in the aftermath of, you know, both in the US and other parts of the world, like in Britain, some of the, you know, the movements around Black Lives Matter um, seem to, you know, seem to expand the interest in abolitionism and transformative justice. The belief that a world beyond carceral logic, which means you know, prisons and other forms of kind of containment that doesn't actually solve the roots of the issue. You know, it kind of that it's the belief that a world beyond that is possible, and punishment, perhaps that sort of punishment is possible. But then there have been, and there still are organizations like, the Nazis, like ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, whose entire project is, based on annihilation. Many actually have called both of them essentially death cults, right? How how can hate guide us in how we approach organizations like, ISIS or the Nazis?
Mm. I mean, the thing that you're touching there has been troubling me a lot while writing the book and still does today. And I do not have a simple answer because, like, when I hate, and I wrote about this very openly in the book, there is a cop somewhere in my head demanding punishment. I want the person I hate to be punished. At the same time, I am an abolitionist, and I know that ideologies of punishment and these causal ideologies you were talking about are the same ideologies used to justify prisons, police violence, or imperial wars, even. There are both products and stabilizers of patriarchal racist capitalism. So, of course, the challenge is therefore how do we build political movements that allow hatred as a reaction to injustice that can even mobilize it, but that do not simply reproduce the punitive logic of the state. But I think many abolitionist movements already kind of do exactly that. Like if hatred is this emotion of abolition, and if violence sometimes has to answer violence in what form ever, then we must at the same time build structures of care and different emotional landscapes in which punishment is not the only possible response, especially in our relationships with one another, like as, for example, friends or comrades. And talking about Rojava, I mean, in my book, I examine hatred across different historical and political contexts, like anti-colonial resistance. We already talked about that, like queer feminist resistance, Jewish and Roma resistance against German fascism. And the common thread is the question of resistance, self-defense, and revenge. So hatred interests me, of course, as this thunderous no to injustice and oppression, but and a refusal that can bring clarity. But as a political activist and also as an abolitionist, I also know that hatred alone and the no alone cannot build a better world. So I ask myself, in which movements do we find both this politics of hatred, like the radical rejection of the existing order, at the same time, this many yeses, also as the Zapatistas say, to life and to liberation and different ways of living, and where the future we are fighting for is already being kind of prefigured. And there are all these abolitionist movements, as I already mentioned, but one example I looked at is, of course, also the Kurdish liberation movement, where narratives of revenge and uncompromising resistance against the enemy are deeply rooted and politically mobilizing there, because they're like people targeted by oppression and genocides and whatever, like for a very long time. But since the revolution in North and East Syria, in Rojava, and the establishment of the Democratic Autonomous Administration in 2016, we also saw an attempt to build a new social model, like, as you said, ecological and anti-capitalist agriculture, gender equality, and especially also forms of coexistence between Kurds, Arabs, Armenians, Syrians, Turkmen, many others who have often been locked in violent conflicts for centuries, and now they are trying to build a shared society. So when I was writing the book in 2022, I spoke with women in Rojava, both Kurdish and Arab women, and asked them, so what about your hatred? What happened to it? Like, what about revenge? How does that coexist with the moral revolution you're trying to build? And their answer was, yes, of course, we still hate our oppressors, our like the ISIS or the Turkish occupiers, but they're also aware that political emotions like hatred and revenge can themselves be patriarchal constructions that destroy life and community, especially for women. Like, I mean, the typical so-called honor killings, for example. And we saw this also again when jihadist militias and the Syrian transitional government attacked Rojava, and horrific images circulated in the internet, like images celebrating the murder of these women fighters, like throwing their
Mm,
corpses from buildings or displaying their braids as trophies, and this male misogynistic sense of finally we have our revenge. So
mm,
that's why I always say that I did not write a manifesto for hatred. Like, I think, and that was already the point I made with my first book, emotions do not have a fixed nature. They are not like inherently good or bad. It they can be emancipatory tool, but also the opposite. And so for me, this strategic hatred I'm talking about in the book means knowing when hatred must be like cultivated, but also when it must be buried, and that judgment must always be connected to the questions of liberation, like liberation for all, but
mm.
also to realistic assessment of our political possibilities.
I mean, speaking of, you know, where hate can be essentially a patriarchal construct, you spoke about honor killings, but also, what has driven, kind of like some of the actions of, historically, but also in more recent times, kind of like, uh, jihadis, either in the form of ISIS or the Syrian interim government. It also, and as you said, hate as a transformative emotion isn't inherently good or bad, and therefore there's obviously examples of it that are bad in that they are definitely not for liberation and actually seemingly to deepen the systems that we see around us. And that's also made me think about, in this whole thing that has been actually happening for some time, but seems to have been, really exponentially taken off. Really like, boomed in the last few years, which is what some people call the so-called manosphere. And, in the context of that, led by figures like Andrew Tate and seemingly institutionalized by some in power, both in the US but also in other parts of the world as well. It seems that, the main ambition there is power and not just a piece of the cake, but the entire cake. But what I've also thought about is that actually hate in that, are these people driven by hate? And is this an example of basically hate in service of power rather than liberation? But I've also thought, do some of these people hate or do they fear something else?
That is a very good question. I invented a new word with the book, and it's called hatification, like the hatification of political contradictions. Because I think when we, for example, talking about misogyny, which is in German usually translated as hatred against women or queer people, I sometimes also think it doesn't necessarily mean that the man killing his girlfriend or his wife or his whatever ex necessarily hates them. It's just like the system of oppression and misogyny and patriarchy also functions without these emotions. And we also see this, for example, on a broader level on how conflicts in the so-called Middle East are often reported, like wars or armed resistance or even genocides are frequently framed as the products of hatred rather than as conflicts rooted in geopolitical interests or imperial power struggles. Of course, hatred can play a role, but it is not the origin of resistance or oppression. It is the product of these conditions. So that's the reason why I call this hatification of political contradictions.
Mm,
And as you already also mentioned, that means in the same time often lead to say, okay, like states, as you already also mentioned, that is in the same time, like the hostility or the violence coming from states are framed as normal or natural, and the state absolves itself of hate entirely as if politics were just an emotionally neutral space. But we know that isn't true, and rulers and governments act sometimes emotionally too. But still, we should be careful not to reduce state violence simply to emotion and say, for example, that repression against workers, poor people, or in Germany, especially, for example, against pro-Palestinian activists, happens because the German state hates Palestinians. So that may well be true for many state officials, but the violence primarily serves as a political function. And all this, for example, Staatsräson thing, like the reason of state of Germany, like this unconditional solidarity with Israel, that all serves a specific purpose, like maintaining Western influence in the Middle East or protecting economic relationships. And yeah, like in this specific case, for example, allowing Germany to present itself as a redeemed post-anti-Semitic society that now fights the anti-Semitic enemies within, often meaning migrants and the left. And also, when we look into the history again, hate reveals very direct questions of power, like, as I said, who's considered human and who can be stripped of humanity at any moment, who's granted self-determination and who's not, and who has power over whom. And we can already see this, for example, in the way ancient philosophers discussed emotions. Like Aristotle, for example, wrote extensively about emotions, about hatred, but especially about anger. And in his text named Rhetoric, he analyzes emotion and he distinguishes between virtues like moderation or being gentle. These are considered as desirable, while emotions like anger or hatred are treated as dangerous effects that must be controlled by reason. And of course, Aristotle did not consider all humans capable of reason. Like in practice, the ideal rational subject was a very specific figure, was the free property owning male citizen. But that's another discussion for another day. But one thing is very crucial to remember in the context of this philosophy of emotions. Aristotle discusses this emotional hierarchies in his book Rhetoric, like precisely in the context of, for example, persuasion before judges. Like the idea is in situations of conflict, emotions like anger could provoke a judge or those in power. And the existing order does not require passionate rebellion, it threatens rebellion with punishment. Instead, it demands that people navigate the system carefully rather than challenge it. So we see that from antiquity onward, judgments about hatred and about emotions more broadly have therefore always been entangled with relations of power. And these philosophies or ideologies of emotions and also like this inflation of emotional and moralizing appeals ultimately function to obscure these very relations of domination.
I mean, it seems that, particularly throughout, the different eras of history that you've spoken about, that emotions in general, and it seems hate being one of them for sure, but actually like a whole range of emotions, um, were kind of suppressed, or there was a morality attached to it because they were seen as disruptive. And now you said as well, in our conversation that no emotion is inherently good or bad, and it's not necessarily it's not a given that it will, automatically do something good. So, as a final question, what I do want to ask you is, in that context, if we think about emotions as, something that can service liberation, as also one way you've put it, what are maybe some of the ways that, emotions, including some of the ones we've spoken about today, can be organized? Yeah, how can emotions be organized, both individually and collectively, to be in service of liberation?
I always think that a practical starting point in dealing with emotions is, first of all, is always to overcome shame, like the shame of feeling like hateful, vindictive, or resentful. And I think this is also especially important for women and queer people who are often criticized or targeted as like expressing those emotions. And I think sometimes the answer has to be, yes, I'm hating, yes, I'm resentful. So and I think everything else has to be negotiated also collectively in movements, in struggles, in the places where we live and organize. So through the stories we tell each other, through like also looking at the long, long history of anti-fascist or of liberation movements. So I think we have to ask together where can hatred help us also refuse indifference? Where can it stop us from turning away? In that sense, that hatred can also become a promise, like a promise to fight for a future that is truly worth living. And I think to stick to this idea of a future is a very crucial point of our resistance right now at the moment, where all these capitalist elites and fascist elites are trying to rip us of our future and the sense of the future. So yeah, that can also be, as I said, with hatred or love, but I think we also have to talk much more about political grief, for example, in order to do that.
Thank you so much, Şeyda. Thank you for your thoughts and your time and for this really, really brilliant conversation.
Thank you so much, Elif. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.